A supreme orc emerged from that gate, and it was clear that predators with unusual skills existed in this world. They possessed no intelligence, but their superior hunting habits allowed them to surpass man himself. The tart odor of blood and human flesh excited them. However, due to the fact that they came here as scouts, they had to suppress their true nature, for the task at hand was paramount. So the hunter, who had been lurking in the shadows for weeks, did not need to look for his prey, for his sixth sense told him that game was plentiful and right above them. The structure of the structure resembled the citadel in some ways. One of the orcs began to say that he would start the hunt, and the other should call his brothers. That orc decided that after putting down all the humans and taking this fortress under siege, they would start the real hunt. First of all, he would clear the way for them, and as soon as he stepped into the corridor, he saw many students standing at the end of the corridor. One of the students noticed the monster that was across from her. They all turned around and couldn't understand what it was. But that supreme orc was already attacking the nearest people who were standing near it. At this time, Jin Woo stood and watched the gate that was across from him, and he realized that it looked even bigger in person than it did in the video he was watching. He noticed that there was a collection team on the right and an extraction team on the left. There were 30 A-Rang hunters and 20 W-Rang hunters among the attackers, and there were still many A-Rang hunters. No wonder, since this guild had the largest number of A-Rang hunters. But suddenly, Jin Woo heard someone start to address him, and as soon as he turned around, he saw so many hunters standing in front of him and started telling him that he was great in that raid on the island and how he had summoned those dark warriors. Was it summoning magic? They all started asking, and Jin Woo couldn't answer anything, because there were too many of them and they were asking all different questions. Suddenly, one of the girls ran up to him and started to tell those groups of hunters to calm down, because don't they see that they are inconveniencing the hunter Jin Woo with their questions? That girl started to introduce herself. Her name was Jong Rim. I was the head of the healers from the elite attack squad of the Knights Guild, and she doesn't know what about the others, but she thinks that as the two most responsible people, they should get along with each other. And you don't think so? She asked the hunter Jin Woo. But at that moment, Jin Woo turned around and started to tell that hunter he had recently talked to in his office what he hadn't told him. And suddenly that hunter began to say that now was the time and began to tell all the hunters who had gathered near him that the current raid would be led by him. But those hunters who were standing in front of him started to say that it was him again. Why is that? After all, they already have a Jin Woo hunter. But the leader began to answer them that the Jin Woo hunter would have their backs and ensure their safety. But those hunters started to say that he really thinks that they are so weak that they need someone to protect them, and one of the guys started to ask Jin Woo, does he also think that their Knight Guild is only made up of weaklings? But the leader started to say that it's nothing like that, the youngsters are going, and asked Jin Woo if he thought the same thing himself, because maybe the root of the problems lies a bit deeper in upbringing. Well, or something like that, and Jin Woo told him that he agreed, because this guy has a lot of confidence. As soon as the time came, the leader realized that they had to move out, and the raid began. And at the same time, a call started coming into the Hunters Association, and a girl picked up the phone and started saying that the Public Emergency Communications Center was ready to listen to whoever called. The other end of the line started saying it was the association, and this girl confirmed that was correct. A student from the school started to say that right now there are monsters walking around their school and they have a dungeon open. The dispatcher started asking where they were, and the student said she was hiding in the restroom. She was with a friend, but he was already dead. The dispatcher asked how many monsters she counted nearby or not, but the student didn't know anything. The dispatcher heard a lot of screaming coming through the tube. The apprentice was saying that she was probably going to die now, but the dispatcher wanted to calm her down and started telling her to listen carefully. You see, the hunters are already moving out to help them, and there is no way they will leave them in trouble. Therefore, she must not lose her temper and hold on until the very end. After these words, the student felt better. The dispatcher began to ask her if she happened to know what kind of species the topic monsters referred to. The student replied that she had seen them on TV, but she had forgotten what they were called and began to remember. The dispatcher asked her to describe them, what kind of monsters they were, and what they looked like, and the student began to say that they had a body like a human and a scary face. Suddenly she remembered that they had green skin and it was an orc. She also remembered that they were called orcs on TV. But at this time, this orc with a big gray had already entered the restroom and was heading towards the student who was hiding. Suddenly, there was a very loud scream through the tube and the connection was cut off. However, the dispatcher kept yelling for her to get out of there as soon as possible because they could smell blood. The last thing she heard was the girl screaming for help. Her phone fell to the ground. All the students that were in that school started to get out and were horrified at what they saw. They noticed a lot of blood scattered on the walls and outside and started to run away. But suddenly one of the students started to stop and ask her friend to stop, because her friend was still at school. But that guy started telling her that the hunters would sort it out and they should run away as soon as possible. There were already people on one of the floors, but they missed them and they managed to run away. But another orc, who was behind the first one, started to say that let him run away, because they still had many left, who were hiding upstairs, and they had nowhere to run to. They were ready to sweep the next floor and decided that they would kill everyone in this school on the floor above, where everything was trashed. Some students had blocked the doors so no one could get inside, and they stood with what weapons they could find, a school chair and a mop for cleaning. A few more students stood on the task, but suddenly they heard some sound and the doors that were barricaded started flying apart. They were all horrified at what they saw, for in front of them stood a mighty, large orc and covered in blood. That orc saw one of the students start to run away, but he knew that there was another one hiding behind the wall, and he swung his big axe and smashed the wall that separated the student from him, and at the same moment the student said goodbye. In his life, and those two big orcs stood there and started to feel the man with magic powers, and one of the orcs said that they should kill him first so that he wouldn't make trouble. And in a corner of one of the school classes there were many students who were forgotten in the corner, and one of the students was a sister, Jin Woo, who closed her eyes and thought only that her brother would come and save her because she was very scared. But suddenly, there was a loud shout in that class. No, and one of the girls who was in that class started to say that she was a hunter, though not a ranked hunter. But Jin Woo's sister started telling her to calm down a bit. The minks who were standing in front of them looked and realized that it wasn't her, but the strong magic was coming from that girl standing next to her. And judging by her scent, it was that girl. The single source decided to finish her off at that very moment, but the girls started to get scared and lowered their heads. But suddenly, as soon as they opened their eyes and saw that nothing had happened, they noticed another orc in front of them. It was the shadow soldier and her brother who had grabbed the orc that was attacking. It was at that moment that her sister realized that it was the protection her brother had provided. The shadow orc hit the green orc with great force and it flew off into the sky. The other orc, who was watching all this, was greatly frightened. He saw three huge orcs in front of him who, although they were his kin, were now standing and protecting the humans. He couldn't understand why they were doing this. At the same time, Jin Woo entered the dungeon, and the hunters who were with him in this raid started shouting that they had seen a two-headed orc. The leader began to say that everyone needed to focus now, as they were facing a dangerous opponent. The huge orc, as soon as he saw the hunters, became furious and started swinging his big axe towards the hunters. But that hunter who was standing in front of him didn't get confused and started using his skill, and a barrier appeared in front of him. And as soon as that big hammer reached its target, there was a big explosion, and that hunter managed to contain its pressure. At that moment, he started screaming for help, and the other hunters realized that they started to act. He climbed up on that big axe and started running on it towards the big orc with the aim of finishing him off. Once he got to his target, he wounded those two big heads, but he was aiming for the eyes. He started talking so that everyone could rely on him. The other hunters, after that, started to act, because that monster couldn't see anything anymore. When it tried to open its one eye, which was not badly hurt, the hunters had already finished it off. Then, the mages who were standing behind began to use their spells. A large lightning bolt and a rain of fire attacked that big monster, and it fell to the ground. The hunters decided to look around first before resuming their journey. The leader realized that the circumstances were very bad now, for this raid was not going to be an easy one, and a two-headed ogre fell upon them from the start. The leader began to ask Jin Woo if he knew their true purpose. He immediately replied that they were grave guards. If he was a normal dungeon boss, it wouldn't raise any questions. However, if you encounter a two-headed ogre at the entrance, it can only mean one thing: the undead dwell here. As soon as they remembered them, they immediately appeared, and all the hunters began to worry and ask about the leader. What should they do? Should they attack or should they not? But all of a sudden, they started to behave strangely, and they stopped. However, the hunters didn't understand what was happening to them and why. They ran away as soon as they saw them, because usually a live one would attack people. Maybe they were scared of something, but Jin Woo, who was standing behind them, reflected that he didn't expect this when he walked here. Suddenly, Jin Woo felt some strange feeling. At this moment, Jin Woo began to tell the hunters that he needed to leave as he had urgent matters to attend to. But the leaders didn't understand what he was talking about and started saying that without him, their team might die. He should have realized it himself, but Jin Woo replied that he knew about it and would now call his friend, who they could also rely on, and handle it himself. However, the leaders still couldn't understand what he was talking about, and as soon as he saw that Jin Woo had summoned his general ant, they didn't realize that it was the same ant from the island. Jin Woo went on to say that it seemed like everyone was already aware of it and wouldn't have to waste time explaining. He replaced himself and began to tell his general to protect the people, and anyone who doesn't belong to the people can do as they please. After these words, General Ant began to shout for joy as he was very happy that he could have some fun. The hunters who were standing nearby realized that they would now go with him. The girl standing next to him called her comrade Mr. Jin Woo. Eventually, a backup consisting of many ants appeared. There were about 20 of them. But the leaders behind and the healer girl standing next to him still tried to stop Jin Woo, saying that he had just summoned a bunch of monsters for nothing. Jin Woo turned around with a serious face and started telling them that if they wanted, he could call them back, but it was better than nothing. After such a serious matter, they could no longer say anything and only agreed. Jin Woo, who was standing in this queue, looked at how much more time was left to recover the skill. There was still 1 hour and 42 minutes left, and he didn't understand why it happened at this particular moment. Jin Woo started running towards the exit of this dungeon with all his speed. He ran at full speed and realized that the signals from the soldiers he had attracted to his sister did not stop, and he had a bad feeling. Suddenly, he saw many soldiers of the undead army in front of him and started shouting to tell them to stay out of his way. Suddenly, all the undead began to kneel down and worship him. Jin Woo didn't realize what was happening. After all, they were worshipping him because he specialized in necromancy. But right now, he didn't have time to think about it, so he summoned his dragon Kaisel, who soared under his feet. And as soon as Jin Woo got out of the dungeon, at that very moment, he started flying his dragon towards his sister. Everyone on this side of the portal watched in surprise as Hunter Jin Woo was heading somewhere. On his dragon, Jin Woo started telling him to fly as soon as there is power towards his sister, and to fly even faster, he applied a skill that is used on all shadow soldiers, and the skill level of each shadow soldier increased by 50%. The orcs that were guarding Jin Woo's sister were destroying the other orcs that had pounced on them. The battle was very vivid, but the green orcs were defeated. The disciples who were watching this with amazement saw the ferocious Shadow Supreme orcs killing the ordinary orcs, and in the end, the latter were defeated. The disciples realized that these monsters were protecting one of the female disciples, and they were now on their side. Jin Woo's sister stood behind one of the orcs and asked if her brother had already come and was here. But one of the orcs stopped her and pointed his thumb at the window, thus saying that he would arrive here soon. At this time, the last barrier that was inside broke, and one of the orcs sitting on the throne began to listen to one of his servants, who was telling him that now as Grokrat, the leader of the Red Knife tribe, no one would be able to interfere. But another orc turned to Grokrat and said that the orcs were helping the humans, and there were 3 of them here, and they were at the school. Grokrat began to get angry, for warriors from the most powerful clan were a weakness, and he decided that he would have to deal with them himself. He took his big axe and went to them, for it was time for a massacre. A little while later, the ants that stayed in the other dungeon and fought for the humans were screaming loudly as they killed their opponents. The hunters who were watching all this were thinking about whether they should leave. After all, they were afraid to imagine what would happen if the ants suddenly pounced on them. But the leader, the mountain, realized that right now they couldn't stop the raid. And even if they could, the reporters wouldn't leave them so easily. And even though some hunters are afraid of them, they can't do that. They need to finish the raid, but suddenly Ant Bear appeared near the leader and thus scared her. However, as soon as the leader wanted to say something, the ant disappeared and at the same moment appeared at the same place where he was standing, with great speed rushed away. Iwat had already thrown his paws and threw something on the ground at the feet of the leader after a second. The leader sitting on the ground saw a large ant in front of him. It looked at him, turned around, and started walking away with its army of ants in the other direction. The hunters who ran up to him started asking if everything was okay and what they should do, follow them or stay here. But the leader replied that everything was fine. As soon as they lowered their heads, they saw the head of the Death Knight lying at their feet. They were surprised, because that ant had slain a top-level monster with one swing, and they couldn't believe how strong he was. Suddenly, the leader realized and started smiling. After all, no one knows how much top-tier crystals are worth if that's the case. Yet they couldn't leave right now. As soon as the leader looked up, he saw that all the hunters started to go straight for the ants. But at this time, a new battle was brewing between the orcs in the school, and the orc Groker showed up to place herself behind her comrades, and her ward orcs stood behind him and began to all shout Grokter together. Grokter began to say that his orc tattoos symbolized the number of victories and showed how many enemies had fallen at his hands. Looking at his opponents, he realized that they had inflicted quite a few kills as well. However, that was all they were capable of, and he began to swing his large sword, telling the higher orcs to have fun with it while he was here having fun with them. But just as he swung his great sword, another orc parried his blow. But that didn't stop him, and Grokter put even more effort into it, slicing the shadow orc in half. However, he suddenly saw the shadow orc recover and realized that it was magic. No matter how many blows he threw, it was all useless. He thought about the fact that he could kill and wanted to kill 100, wanted to kill 1,000 times, but suddenly this orc started to feel some voices in his head. There were voices in his head that were urging him to kill all humans. He began to realize that each time the voice in his head was getting stronger and he needed to finish off these orcs as soon as possible. He realized that if he could control them with magic, he needed to destroy the caster. He realized that behind all of this is the girl who is hiding among her servants so that they can capture her as soon as possible, as she is weakened if the orcs are constantly regenerating. They must all attack the orcs before they have time to regenerate, and thus capture the girl quickly. But the last shadow orc that was left was able to grab the other two orcs, and Jin Woo's sister was left unprotected. At this moment, a separate shrew appeared, grabbed her head and began to say that he always knew it was her, for he could clearly feel her magic. Just as he decided to finish her off, he began to feel something approaching in the distance and his hands began to shake. With that, he was able to let go of Jin Woo's sister, and she fell to the ground. Her girlfriend ran up to her and started asking if she was alright. But the orc who was watching with his gut felt something approaching him, something terrible, and it made him shake with fear. And suddenly, the leader of the Grokter began to tell his servants to get down as soon as possible. And at that moment, an explosion sounded in the room and someone burst into the room, raising a large dust, causing all the disciples to start coughing. It was Jin Woo, who had managed to arrive in time after all. He put his hand on his sister's head and started telling her that everything was fine now and she was safe. All the orcs started to back away and Grokter saw a large dragon in front of him and a strange hunter with a terrifying power coming from him. He started to tell him that he was Grokter of the Red Knives, but before he could finish, Jin Woo turned to him and pointed his index finger at him, telling him to shut up and wait. Then he hugged his sister and started to say that she was safe and apologized for being late. At that moment he turned to the other students and asked if they were okay, and he heard that they were fine, and Sonia, who was standing next to him, said she was fine. But suddenly she noticed a frightening aura coming from Jin Woo, but suddenly he noticed that her sister had a red mark on her face because that orc had grabbed her with his big hand and lifted her into the air. And at that moment, he got very angry and called his shadow commander, Agris, and ordered him to take care of his sister, and the soldiers who were also summoned had to get the children out of the school. Orcs who were standing nearby began to cower in fear, and suddenly they moved and Jin Woo sensed it and started telling them that he had ordered them to stand still and wait their turn, while all the students were slowly leaving the school on the dragon that was standing below it. One of the orcs started to say that he was controlling those warriors and asked who he was and how he knew their language. But that orc only saw in front of him an enraged hunter who could barely contain his incredible strength from destroying them in 1 second, and he realized that he wasn't going to get an answer. They all started pouncing on him together, but Jin Woo stood still and waited for them to run closer and closer. As soon as one of the orcs swung at him, Jin Woo grabbed him by 2 fingers, and he started screaming at the top of his voice in incredible pain. Not even a few seconds later, that orc was already slumped on the ground and stomped his feet into the rocks that were flying from his large body. But Jin Woo didn't take long and finished him off with a single kick of his foot. At the same time, the remaining 2 orcs, despite the death of their comrade in arms, rushed to flee. However, Jin Woo used his ruler hand skill and the 2 orcs began to rise into the air. When he squeezed his hand, both orcs turned into a pile of meat. After that, the entire pack of orcs that were in the room started screaming furiously and running towards the hunter. But he didn't want to just stand there and wait, so he used his bare hands to pierce through their bodies, and in a few seconds they were all down. Only their leader remained, who stood in the corner and shook, for he did not understand how this was possible. As soon as he wanted to say something, Jin Woo's hand grabbed his head and pushed him against the wall. Jin Woo, while he was holding him near the wall, noticed that the corridor where the orcs came from had a lot of students lying on the ground and bleeding. He turned the other way and saw the same thing from another corridor, and started to ask, why are they killing people like that? Norm started to answer something, as if in his head he could hear people killing him. And Jin Woo started saying, what about me? Do you want to kill me too? But in response, the orc just started to beg and wanted him to spare him. But Jin Woo asked again while looking at him, and he heard a voice too. Tears began to flow in the orc's eyes, and the hunter realized that to them, he wasn't human at all. And at that moment, his blade began to appear in his other hand, and finally Jin Woo began to say that it didn't matter anymore and he would spare him. However, he shouldn't expect to enjoy this process. At this time, in that big gate where there were very many hunters from the Night Guild, one of the healers started pulling clothes in his direction and saying that he at least understands how much it costs. Big Ant still didn't listen to her and started devouring those monsters that were in that dungeon. She started to say that vampire soul crystals are very expensive, and just as she twitched, this ant accidentally hurt her. She raised her head and saw that ant start devouring that vampire anyway. And this was all noticed by the general ant, and he ran up to the healer, extended his big paw and started healing her wounds. In 1 second she didn't even have a scratch. She thanked him and realized it was healing magic, and she couldn't understand why his healing skills were better than hers. After all, he is an ordinary shadow monster and Ant is a general with his army of ants. At the beginning they went to some direction, and at the end of the corridor they came across a door that started to open. Behind the door was already the boss of this dungeon, who was eager to kill them. And once all the hunters saw the horrible boss and the horrible guards, they were surprised that the boss of this dungeon turned out to be an archlich. The archlich was known to be considered the most dangerous among all the bosses in the dungeon, and never before had any guild been able to destroy it. However, thanks to a high-level hunter, this incident did not turn into a disaster of great magnitude. Now they were faced with the task of facing the undead army that was approaching from behind. The leader began shouting for them to close the doors as soon as possible, for those that hadn't been eaten by the ants had come back to life and were ready to attack. The mage girl activated her sacred defense skill, but the leader realized that they were trapped, and now without Hunter Jean they would have a hard time. The healer girl started shouting to the leader that her sacred defense would only last 5 minutes, but no more. Suddenly the leader heard some shouting and started to turn that way. He saw the ant general who was approaching the boss. The boss of this dungeon was also speaking in human language and started to say that he couldn't believe his eyes. He was wondering why the king's troops were fighting against them, since the king himself had chosen them, but the undead army did not. The boss of this dungeon couldn't believe what he heard, for it was impossible, and he would report to the king about it. But the ant didn't want to wait long and jumped up to the boss at that very second, hitting him with all his might. From a blow the boss began to fly aside, and the ant ended the conversation with the words, "For someone who was about to die, you talk too much." After a hard blow, the Lord Earth ant started to fly off to the side. But at that moment, the ant began to pull his heart out of his chest. And since he had a very powerful strength, he easily ripped out his heart. All of the dungeon boss's servants began to fall off their feet, as their lives were no longer supported by any dark energy. The hunters who saw this realized that he had dealt with the dungeon boss and the undead army in one blow. They didn't understand how he managed it. The leader, looking at the ant that was eating him, shouted. He knew he was possessed, but to be this strong, he had no idea. The other hunter walked up to the raid leader and began to tell him that with such an arsenal of shadow, Hunter Jin Woo didn't even need to do anything. His warriors could mop up any dungeon by themselves. When you think of it like that, a soldier didn't necessarily need to spend all of his mana on summoning, but only half of it. Based on this fight, it's not hard to guess that many gameplay approaches and my items are no good. Suddenly, one of the hunters started suggesting to their leader that they forget about their original plan and join the Jin Woo Hunters Guild. The leader started to reply that this is nasty and he doesn't even know what to say to him. After all, merging with another guild, if you can call it that, a fine guild founded by a top hunter. And the Knights Guild, which is in the top 5 of the strongest guilds in their country, pulls off such a deal. To this, the other hunter started to reply that he was just kidding and really didn't think they could pull it off. After all, judging from the hunter Jin Woo's reaction today, it looks like he doesn't really need them. But the leader didn't like it, and started telling his comrade that according to him, since he had become an S-ranked hunter, the law didn't apply to him. But his comrade apologized to him, but the leader still started to say that if he can clear entire dungeons with his soldiers, then the rules are the same for everyone, and to start a raid. You need to gather a group of several people, and everyone, including the hunter, must comply with it. After all, everyone knows such obvious things. But his comrades started saying that it's a good idea, and they can provide him with men and heat him with his power. And it's a win-win. But the leader thought the same way and realized that if they really did this, what would others think of them? Suddenly the idea came to them that they could say it was support, that they just wanted to support him. At this time, it was raining a huge rain outside. And after this incident in the school, all the parents started to gather near the entrance of the school and wanted to personally check what had happened, because their children were in the school at that time. And some mourned for those who were carried out on stretchers. At that time, Hunter Jin was riding in the car with the president of the association, and he began to tell the hunter that the 213 students who had escaped from the school at the beginning of the incident were now safe, and 10 students had been safely rescued. And the rest, if they had reacted immediately, it might have been avoided. He starts giving his phone to the hunter and says that over the past 6 months, the village has seen an increase in new dungeons appearing. And below are the statistics for the whole world, and as he can see the number of new ones is growing exponentially. But that wasn't the strangest thing, as there are more and more people who want to know the level of their awakened abilities. At the same time, the number of hunters who can resist the strongest monsters is growing. And it seems as if some system is trying to balance everything out. Jin realized that something was beginning to change in their world, and he began to ask the president of the association about Japan, America, China, France, England, Germany, and even distant Central Asia. The president of the association began to give the hunter the data of those countries that wished to officially make contact with him, and he was already sure that among them there were already those who had done so unofficially. The president of the association began to say that the association had no right to stop them. According to their request, they were merely protecting information about him. And of course, he understands very well that everything depends on his decision, but he is afraid that if he wants to leave the country in the current situation, it will be difficult for him to adapt. After a long conversation, they soon arrived at the hospital where the sister was, and as soon as the hunter started to get out of the car, the president of the association told him that they would try to provide him with everything he needed. Correct the text for errors and say, could he not have officially stayed in South Korea by incorporating into their country? There are 10 registered hunters and 3 of them are already lost, an association and 2 have died at the hands of monsters in America. They can't stay away anymore, so he started to ask that they, at least this time, play a part in their fate. At the end, the president of the association asked the hunter what he ultimately wanted. Jin Woo answered him that in that case, he would allow him to enter the dungeon at the top of the mountain alone. The association president started to tell him that if he understood correctly, he wanted him to remove the restriction on the minimum number of people in the group. Jin Woo replied to him that that was correct, and the president started to say that this restriction was made to at least keep the hunters a little safer, because during the raid each of them risked losing their lives, and he still wanted him to remove the restrictions. Suddenly, the president realized that the reason why he created the guild was to mop up the dungeon himself. Jin Woo asked the association president if they were willing to fulfill his request. The president of the association realized that he was a one-man army and began to say that of course it was difficult but not impossible, and he would do his best. At the same time, one of the videographers started telling the reporter that she did a great job. She thanked him, and at that moment the phone in her hand started ringing. It was her brother, who started asking her if she wanted to join their guild, and instead of sitting in their father's guild department out of sight, why don't she move over to them and enjoy the freedom? But she didn't understand why all of a sudden he brought it up. And by the way, does he know that Jin-hee is going back to Korea? Jin-ho replied that he knows. After all, why shouldn't he know about it? After all, she is his own sister. The truth is, she's now more concerned about the fact that they lack one more person to form a full guild. And his sister has started saying that he's now trying to lure her into a guild that isn't even registered yet. He's sure he hasn't messed with some strange type who's trying to scam him, but Jin-ho started telling her that if she knew who this strange type was, she'd be very surprised. She asked who the strange type was. A little while later, Jin Woo stood with a surprised face and started to say that this was the very person he was talking to. Jin-ho started telling him to meet Suan, his cousin who was a rank hunter. But Suan started to take off her mask and was very surprised, because she saw the hunter Jin Woo in front of her. But Jin-ho started to tell her why she was surprised, because she is a celebrity herself. But Jin Woo started to wonder if this girl is really a hunter. She said that she couldn't believe that she had a chance to meet a hunter who suddenly appeared at Lee Min-sung's press conference and immediately disappeared. But Jin Woo started to sit down on the couch and thought about the fact that Jin Ho is a D-rank hunter and his sister is an A-rank hunter. And maybe awakened abilities are somehow passed down on a genetic level. And there seemed to be such cases amongst siblings. Besides, as far as he knew, his father was also a hunter. And he started telling that girl that he hoped Jin Ho had already told her the details, and she replied that he had. He told her that they needed another member to form a guild, and Jin Woo started to ask if she was really okay with her joining them so that she wouldn't get too much public attention later on. But she replied that it was fine, it was always better than being at the beck and call of Eugene Sung, who was her own brother and known for his bad temper. Suddenly, this girl started asking Jin Woo if he would be okay with her taking a picture with him to update her social media account. At this time, there was a question in the Hunter Association about what he wanted to do with the Shadow Soldiers who were members of the battle group. And he understood the damage all of this could cause. But Jin Woo had no sooner established the guild than they were already voicing their discontent. If it wasn't a privilege, he couldn't believe that the association, which had always been the epitome of honesty and integrity, was willing to go to such lengths for Hunter Jin Woo. He didn't like that the president was sitting silent, and he wanted to hear at least something from him. But the president of the association answered him that he was right. It is indeed a privilege. And he took this opportunity to ask him one question: who would he send first if monsters came out of the dungeon one day, a group of 20 hunters or a group of 1 hunter? Jin Woo. Jin Woo recently moved into an apartment in the Hunters Guild area. Why did he choose to take an apartment that cost much more than the one he used to live in? After saying that, the man started to freak out, and soon he replied that he had no comment. After all, maybe the reason lies in the fact that he wants to secure himself. The president went on to say the same thing concerning the citizens. If they had a lot of money, they would go where it is safest. Right now, guilds from all over the world are trying to recruit Hunter Jin Woo if he thinks he'll choose to stay in Korea with that kind of money. The president decided to ask, otherwise, if they want a repeat of the situation with Hwang Dong-soo flying off to America and think such a privilege is unfair. He hopes they all know who will save their lives when the S-rank gate opens in Korea. But at that time, Huntress Cha was holding her phone in her hand and saw the social media post of that girl who posted about her first day in the Agen Guild. After that, she couldn't believe her eyes and started shaking, for she was very angry and her aura started a house. The next day, the hunters Jin Woo and his partner Jin Ho were standing near the gate, and they had never seen such a big gate before. But Jin Woo began to think that if his partner had seen such a big gate in the dungeon, he would have fainted long ago. After all, the gate was many times larger there. But at this place, there were a lot of reporters gathered near the gate, and they started pestering Hunter Jin Woo and shouting for him to pay some attention to them and share his impression of the Agen Guild's first raid. And why did he name the guild that? And what was his relationship with founder Yu Suchin? But at that moment, the hunter was rescued by the Hunter Association guys, and Jin Woo started asking them, how come all these people are gathered here? And they started to answer him that of course the association was carefully hiding their data. However, they never managed to keep the location of the dungeon secret from the media, and he should be more careful in his social media from now on. After all, because of that picture, everyone knew about this place. But suddenly, Jin Ho started asking his mentor how they would manage without the crystal mining and collecting squads. After all, it seems to him that it would only be more difficult that way. But Jin Woo started to tell him not to worry about it. After all, his shadows will go in their place. The man from the Hunter Association walked over to the Shadow Soldiers and started measuring their wounds with his device. He realized that they were all at higher ranks and were perfect for mopping up the dungeon. At the same time, he realized that those who doubted the chairman's decision were round idiots. When the inspection was complete, he began to take off his suit and explained that he was doing so for maximum safety to make sure they wouldn't be spotted by the monsters. The director asked him to personally escort them and supervise everything that was going on. He hoped that Hunter Jin Woo didn't mind, but she replied that she would only accompany them with his permission. A little while later, they were already inside. The brother and member of the Hunter Association watched with a surprised face as the Shadow Soldiers handled the rank A monster. They all attacked the monsters in this dungeon and tore them to pieces. He realized that they were considered quite strong warriors as well as skilled mages. Even experienced hunters have a pretty hard time with these monsters. But shadow wars that come in numbers, they don't even give them a break. When he turned his attention to Commander-in-Chief Igris, he realized that the latter was particularly good. After all, he was using his cool new sword to launch an attack, and for a normal hunter, such a lightning-fast attack requires a very high level of magical ability. Each swing of the sword is accompanied by a powerful electrical charge that crushes everyone in its path. All the monsters that were within that radius began to die. He looked at Jin Woo's Shadow Hunter soldier and realized that he was most likely ranked or even higher in level. Perhaps even he alone could mop up this dungeon. But suddenly, she turned her gaze to Hunter Jin Woo, who noticed that one of the ants had started eating the monsters, and he kicked it with a kick. That ant flew off into the wall, and Jin Woo started telling him that those monsters were freakishly expensive, and they were just messing around and just eating them. And the next person he started yelling at was the other shadow soldiers to get a move on, because to me they wouldn't get themselves. The man with the Hunter Association realized that this man who could simultaneously mop up dungeons, collect corpses, and obtain mana crystals. Yes, here clearly did not smell like a group consisting of a single hunter. And now it was clear to him why the chairman had asked him to go along with him. Suddenly, the boss of this dungeon was in front of them, and Jin Woo decided to cancel the summoning of all warriors except the mining warriors. The squad began to gather together into a shadow that consisted of Jin Woo. That man didn't understand why he did that. After all, he started to say that they could very well have gotten by. But Jin Woo started to summon his blade and said that if he relied on his shadow warriors too often, he was afraid that his skills would be severely dulled. Suddenly, he shifted and ran towards the boss of this dungeon. He was so fast that he was able to cut him into pieces in the blink of an eye. And at the same time, the notification system showed that the boss of this dungeon had been destroyed. He was able to raise his level to 101 and his specialization level was raised, as well as his shadow summoning skill level. Guardian of Shadows, the domain of a monarch. He was surprised that all the skills had increased and he couldn't believe it until the end. The rollback time of the shadow swap skill would now decrease from 3 to 2 o'clock, and the rollback time had decreased by 1 hour in just one level. If he continued to move at this pace, despite the distance, he would be able to reach his mother and sister at any time. The man from the Hunter Association stood behind Jin Woo's back and thought about the fact that because of his strong scales, the boss of this dungeon could use it as both a shield and a harvest at the same time. And this hunter had pierced it with some daggers. What surprised him was that he saw Jin Woo start to use his skill and turn this dungeon boss into his shadow soldier. And eventually, the shadow extraction was successful. The initial level of the shadow was 13. Jin Woo looked at it, the same class as his shadow mage Fang, and they were even physically similar, however it had shrunk a lot, and usually their size didn't change. Though despite that, there was quite strong magic coming from him, and it is somewhat similar to my fangs. Perhaps he can increase in size as well. That's his true appearance, and in any case, it added a few strong guys to his arsenal. Now he had to choose a name for his soldier, and Jin Woo thought about it. He decided that his name would be Jim. When the system showed that the name had been chosen as Jin Ho, watching from the sidelines, he thought about the fact that his mentor was making such strong monsters of his shadows. His mentor just doesn't imitate, but suddenly the dungeon started to collapse and they all realized that they had to leave, because the gate would close after the boss was destroyed. However, Jin Woo turned his head the other way and realized that he had to get this guy somewhere. Soon, as they started to leave the dungeon, all the reporters who were watching saw a huge orc in front of them carrying a huge monster on his shoulder. The reporters thought it was the monsters coming out of the dungeon and started yelling for everyone to run away. But suddenly, they realized that it was Hunter Jin Woo's shadow, and couldn't believe that he had already cleared such a strong dungeon. Everyone amicably started taking pictures with their cameras of this big orc, who didn't realize it first, and then started smiling and scratching his big head. As the hunters started to leave the dungeon, Jin Ho started telling his mentor to smile. There were a lot more reporters went, and apparently they were very attracted to them. Although Jin Woo didn't want that, the man from the Hunter Association was out of breath from what he saw inside the dungeon, and he roughly had no face on him. But a little later, he met with the president of the association. The president started to ask him that this wasn't the first raid he had been to, but from their story, even a veteran like him was very surprised by what he saw. But the man started to say that it was not a raid, but a real massacre. The president of the association said that everything was clear to him now and he could go and rest a little. The man got up, bowed and said that with his permission he would go. The president of the association stood up and started to walk towards the window, thinking about the fact that mopping up the dungeon, collecting corpses and mining crystals he was sorry to admit. But this was a one-man battle, and the guild was roughly speaking from one man. I am ultimately Jin Woo, and there is the guild. And yet, he didn't fail. Korea. No, rather, even in the entire world, the management of hunters might change a lot. But at this time in Japan, in Tokyo, a huge red gate began to appear that covered the entire sky. The people watching all this couldn't understand what it was. They were all in shock, and on the road, the only sound was a low roar calm. Soon, in one of the mansions where naked blades inspired fear in the universe, a meeting of the heads of the major Japanese guilds was secretly convened. There was an important matter at hand. Suddenly, the guys standing near the balcony saw people approaching. It turned out to be the co-owners of the Naked Blades Guild, the servants of the Moto Ranger and other S-rank hunters. But suddenly, another guy interrupted one of them, calling him an idiot, for it wasn't the co-owner, but the leader. In the course of events, they lost 7 S-rank hunters, including Gotoruji, who was the prize dog of the head of the association, Masa Masamoto. It was good that they monopolized all the hunters, but now the Naked Blades Guild was facing the end. If things worked out well, they could become the best guild in Japan. However, the hunters heard their words and turned around, expressions of terror on their faces. Without their lord, they had completely lost their fear and now had to quickly adapt. The hunter girl started to tell her comrade that there are rumors that the Amway Guild is trying to absorb the Salasan Guild, and both guilds have 4 orange hunters like them. To this, the other guy replied that she really believes that by joining together, they will become the strongest in Japan. After all, it's ridiculous, even if all the guilds unite, it's not enough. A little later, in one of the rooms, one of the men started shouting, "Why is the association silent, and why did a rank S dungeon appear right in the middle of it? I don't consider the association's lack of response to be a normal state of affairs, and everyone here should honestly say what would happen if monsters came flying out of it." But one of the guys sitting at the table started to reply, "Even if all the S-rank hunters gather, they won't be enough for such a rank S dungeon. I suggest that all the national level hunters should be summoned." To this, another man with a scar on his face started saying that he was the prime minister and had gathered the heads of the largest guilds to ask them such stupid questions. The consequences would be comparable to the consequences from the crack that opened up on Shinju Island. But the man who was sitting across from him started to say that he was so pessimistic. Doesn't he have any plan, and why doesn't he intend to hire Thomas Andre? To this, the other men in the hall thought that they didn't have enough money to lure him here, and moreover, the mercenaries ready to be hired could be counted. All this because of the large number of new dungeons. And would there be any hunters who would be willing to help with a rank S dungeon? Suddenly, one of the men began to say that there was one who would help, though not for free. It's Yuri Orlov's tank, and they are thinking of hiring him. But a few hundred kilometers away from there, Jin Woo was driving his car and thought about the fact that he was now level 101. At level 101, he had gotten the key to the Kartinan temple, and at level 101, he had increased his exceptional skills. He wondered what would happen at level 102. A little later, when he arrived at his destination, he got out of his car and remembered that his deputy had successfully finished everything by himself. After all, it was good that the deputy had so much enthusiasm. But there is still need to recruit participants. And suddenly he turned his head and noticed Hunter Cha, who was passing by, and started to abruptly turn around and walk in the other direction. Jin Woo didn't stand still, and at the same moment, he moved right towards her. In a fit of confusion, he started to ask her why she was running away and why she was even walking towards their office. But she with a strange face started waving her hands and talking about the car in the parking lot. That's when Jin Woo realized that he couldn't get the car because of the shadow exchange. And as soon as he turned around, Huntress Cha started to say to him, "Could you spare some time for me?" All she had on her mind was wondering if she should ask something. There were pictures on social media and she wondered what the new contestant meant. Why was she rejected and that girl was taken? After all, her rank was lower than S. And she couldn't believe it. Are these two really dating? But suddenly, she began to speak. "I'm now for Hunter Mingbingu to give him a message. And this message is about his selves." But Jin Woo started telling her to wait. After all, they could talk about it in the office. And once they were already inside the office, Hunter Cha first asked him who was in that office. But Jin Woo started to tell her that the deputy said he would stay at the scene. And he asked her what happened and how Hunter Min was able to give her the message. And she began to explain that she had heard a voice that day that said for her to relay those words. Cautious, for the one who had plucked him from the endless darkness was no longer him. Even though he had kept the Raza, he felt like a blind servant created for his sake, and it gave him indescribable joy and frightened him at the same time. But she had asked him then what it meant, and the guy had said that this force was very dangerous and powerful, and he should know that too, and she should remember it. The real Dream Hunter army, and he is the real army. After saying these words, Jin Woo went to the dungeon, and he sat in one and thought about these words. Whether it was true or false, he still decided that he owed it to himself to learn about the essence of his power. After all, it was much more important to buy into the hundreds. But suddenly, his deputy Jin Ho, who was sitting beside him and was also eating himself, started saying that it reminded him of going down to the dungeon from the rank. But Jin Woo didn't like what he was saying with his mouth full. He started to ask his mentor that if his shadows can move around outside of his will, then he can entrust them with his chores when he can't accomplish them himself. For example, when he is eating or very busy. But Jin Woo answered him that it can't be like that, because the more distance between him and his shadow, the less experience he will get, and he doesn't know what they are doing behind his back. Jin Ho starts asking him how his sister is doing in his opinion. This situation is really hard right now. Jin Woo answered him that he thought she should rest for a while, since she has very experienced shadow soldiers around her right now, and her safety can't be worried for now. Suddenly, he decided to remember to see what they were doing. He concentrated, and with the help of a second-level sense transmission effect, he simply focused on his shadow to get a view of the area. And he began to see that his sister was now lying on the couch in front of the TV, which had some movie on. Behind her was Ant, who was switching channels to find something he liked. Jin Woo realized that his sister was asleep, but what takes a puppy, given the manner of speech of this country, he likes. He also likes this kind of series. Another time he saw his mom was in the supermarket and suddenly noticed that drops of water were dripping into the bathtub. In the bathtub sat Hunter Cha. As soon as he realized he looked in the wrong place, his deputy started to ask what was going on with him. Maybe he had dozed off. But Jin Woo replied that he wasn't, but thought about giving her a treat as an apology. Jin Ho started telling him about the S-rank gate that appeared in Japan, and rumors say that it's only 3 days away from being destroyed. Hunters are already gathering from everywhere, and they haven't contacted him. But Jin Woo thought about the fact that it had been so long since they had appeared, and he started to say that they had contacted him. However, he had some urgent matters to attend to, so he was pondering their proposal for now. He thought about the fact that he had an item, the key to the Karthanon temple, and he wondered what kind of invitation it was from the system and what answers lurked there. And so, Jin Woo began to rise up. After all, just talking was enough, and there was only 1 day left, and soon he would know the truth. He started to say that if he had already eaten, it was time to work. Jin Ho jumped up from his seat and started to follow him. But at this time, in one of the buildings, a man whose name was Yuri Orlov began to say that as everyone knew, the best tank among the hunters was him, and he read everything they had sent him. The evacuation of people is a wise decision. And about the chronic lack of manpower, it's true that only 6S rank hunters can be mobilized in Japan. And the man who was sitting in front of him started to reply, "That's right." After all, in order to deal with the dungeons that keep appearing in Japan, every guild must have at least 1 high-level hunter. And their guild had also sent 3 high-level hunters with the exception of 1. But Yuri Orlov thought that this was terrible. After all, how do they want to protect the country? So he put his drink on the table and started telling them that he was willing for $3.6 billion a year, that's 10 million a day, he would block the gate for as long as they needed. And of course, if they would hire him. For 10 million a day, Yuri Orlov can. For that money, he can save an entire country. Compared to Thomas, his services cost less. The hunters who were standing behind couldn't understand what he was saying because they didn't know his language. They guessed that he was saying something unpleasant. Yuri Orlov further announced that they would pay 10 million a day and thus save their country. Otherwise, they risked losing money and being subjected to arbitrary fate. In the current situation, they cannot afford to choose. Even if they begged and fell at his feet, Yuri Orlov would not give the slightest hint of regret. The hunter sitting across from him replied that he was very confident, to which Yuri confirmed that it was natural. After all, it was much better than hiring 100 of the same losers. They don't want to be insulted. Now was the best time to make the right choice, but the 2 hunters behind them tensed up as they thought that Yuri had laughed at them. It was clear without words. But a friend near them began to do something strange, and Yuri Orlov raised his hand, telling them not to even move without his permission. After all, they wouldn't step yet, though they might try if they had the guts. But the two couldn't understand how he had immobilized them. After all, they couldn't even move a finger. Yuri Orlov started to say that he would defend their dungeon, and as a bonus, he would kill all the monsters if they agreed to that option. It was the most suitable option, but the hunters sitting across from him started to say that they had thoroughly analyzed his abilities. However, he wasn't sure if the government would allocate such a budget, and in that second, he wondered. Could he be trusted in such a situation? Suddenly he replied that he understood and he needed to make one call to make a final decision. During this, Jin Woo started to pack and told his mom that he was just leaving, but she looked at him and started to ask if he was okay. But Jin Woo sighed and started to tell her that everything is fine. He just has to meet someone and started to leave the apartment. He said goodbye to his mother, but he had very little time left before the gate would open. As soon as his stopwatch went down to 0, the key he held in his hand began to show the location of the gate where he would be able to use the key to open the doors. At this time, the hunters were standing near the gate that had recently opened. The girl who was watching all of this was pondering the fact that it was unbelievable. After all, 2 gates had opened at the same place at once. Luckily, the school was closed, but there were still schoolchildren snooping around. Suddenly the girl saw some strange man who started to approach them. She started telling him that it was forbidden to walk here. When he threw off his hood, she realized that it was the hunter Jin Woo. He immediately started asking the girl when the gate opened, and she told him it was 3 days ago. This is when he realized that he was a complete fool, because no one had said that the dungeon would open after he knew its location. And since it had already been 3 days, it meant that someone had entered this dungeon. He realized that it was probably with the rank of the dungeon, and he wouldn't say the level was that high. He started asking the girl if the hunters had already entered there, and she told him that it was about 2 hours ago. He started telling her to stop the exploration immediately, but the girl didn't understand why. After all, the results of the exploration showed that this was a ranked dungeon. But Jin Woo insisted and kept saying that those hunters who went in there were in danger. If they didn't hurry up, they would all die. But she didn't understand what he meant, and she saw Jin Woo start to go into that dungeon and tell the others to just stand there and wait. But the girl still didn't understand why he had to say all this. After all, it was possible to just explain the whole situation. But Jin Woo told her that they probably didn't have time. And as soon as he went inside the dungeon, the hunters who had entered before stood in front of the big door and realized that it was the boss's room. But they didn't understand why it was closed, and they started thinking about what they should do, since even magic wouldn't help here. Some of the hunters suggested to just leave, but Jin Woo, who had arrived in time, began to tell them that it was a trap. The hunters were startled by his sudden appearance and started asking him questions. Jin Woo explained that he was one of the highest hunters in the dungeon and had a rank S. They realized that he was an experienced and dangerous hunter. Jin Woo warned them that it was dangerous here and they should go back and he would deal with it himself. When he went to the door and tried to open it, he realized that they were locked and probably enchanted. Suddenly, a notice appeared in front of him that the doors of the temple courtyard were locked and needed a key to open. Jin Woo took out his key, but realized that something had gone wrong this time. The hunters behind him couldn't figure out how he did it since the doors were locked. I, not being a hunter, apologized to Jin Woo and said that this place was already reserved for the raid, so he couldn't kick them out, even being rank S. Jin Woo agreed with them and said he wouldn't stop them. If they wanted to go in, they could continue. The hunters rejoiced that they were right, and suddenly Jin Woo saw a notification from the system that a keyless person had entered the temple. It said that force would be used to destroy the uninvited guest. And as soon as the hunter walked a few steps, the guard who was guarding the entrance forcefully tried to hit him with his big hammer. However, his wife came in time and grabbed the hunter by his armor, throwing him back. They saw before them a horrible monster standing outside the door. Jin Woo began to tell him that if they still wanted to enter, he would not restrain them, but they should listen to him carefully. They should leave this place as soon as possible, and after that, they should contact the association to report that a dual dungeon had opened. After saying these words, Jin Woo entered the large hall and the notification system showed that the key holder had entered, and the doors slammed shut at the same moment. He stood and watched as the torches began to light up and all the tests from last time stood in the same places. Nearby was a large statue that held the rules of this dungeon. He realized that this was where it all started, and he had come here again, but now it was different. He realized it clearly now, and the attestations were no longer monsters. The other creatures are just puppets, and the only one in this room possesses them. Jin Woo began to look at the largest statue that was in this room and began to say that it was none other than him. He started to address it, saying that he would keep his mouth shut like that, and why wouldn't it answer? But suddenly this large statue began to smile terribly, and the verbal smile hiding under the hood began to tell him that he had finally arrived. After all, they were already waiting. At this time, Yuri Orlov arrived at one of the airports in Japan, and all the reporters were fixated only on him. On this day, the reporters started telling him to look in their direction and started asking him questions about how he planned to block the gate. He answered them that he would make a magic circle around the gate as always. And then when he activates the magic, they'll lock down and no one will be able to get out of there since it's a rank S gate. Most are skeptical of this so far, and can he make a couple comments? He started to answer that no problem, granted, his magic alone wouldn't be enough to maintain a barrier of that power. However, he can absorb the magical energy of the objects around him, and to block the gate, he would need mana crystals to be placed all over Tokyo. He will simply activate the spell, after which the barrier will begin to absorb mana and become as fast as a wall. By doing so, he will save everyone, and they should remember that. And this live broadcast was being watched from his office by the president of the association? Or was he? But he was afraid to imagine what would happen if he couldn't contain the S-rank gate. Suddenly, the association president turned to his ward and started asking him how Hunter Jin Woo was doing. To which the latter replied that he was currently protecting a dungeon in the Seoul area, and he held out a list of the dungeon to the association president that was available upon Ajin Guild's request. But he was afraid that there might be some disagreements with the White Tiger, Hunters, and Reapers guilds because of this. But it was hard for the president of the association to believe that a small guild consisting of just one person could become on par with the larger guilds. After all, it was so ridiculous that it even made one want to cry. His assistant was in complete agreement with his words. But the president wondered what they needed it for. But the underling replied that he didn't know anything. They were only asked to make sure that no one entered the territory of the gate for a week. But the president of the association realized that there should be no problem with that. Suddenly the assistant's phone rang and he asked the president of the association if he could step aside for a moment. But the president replied that he could go for 2 minutes, because he had an appointment. So he would go too. And as soon as he picked up the phone, they started telling him that they had received an urgent message from the raid site and their presence was required. And if he remembers where that school where the orcs recently appeared is now, at first glance there's nothing much there. But they say that a double dungeon opened up in the nasty hall of that school, and also the Hunter Jin Woo went in there alone. Hunter Jin Woo was already in that dungeon, and he looked at the terrifying statue that started to rise, and 6 large stone wings appeared from it. He saw the large stone slab that had the rules of the Kartinan temple written on it start to break in the hands of that statue. Until that moment, he had turned to the hunter who had finally come to him. But Jin Woo saw the stone slab just split open, and he began to say that it seemed that the rules that were inscribed on it originally didn't make sense. However, the creator began to answer him that it wasn't that simple at all. Now those rules really weren't needed, and Jin Woo began to ask the creator why he had called him here. And the creator replied that that was exactly what it was, but the hunter was interested in the fact that whether he was a monster or not. The creator answered him that he had asked his question wrong, and instead of asking who is he, it was better to ask who are you. And as soon as he clapped his stone palms together, all the stats that were in this room began to move. Now the final test would begin. If he could endure it, he would learn everything about himself, and that would be his parting gift. But Jin Woo started to summon his shadow soldiers, but the creator snapped his stone fingers and told him that it wouldn't work that way. After all, they are in an exam and all class skills have been blocked. After all, this test is only for him and the creator is not interested in his loyal subjects. Jin Woo started to see a notification from the system that buying potions from the store was forbidden, and healing by leveling up the daily task was impossible. Jin Woo stood at the same spot and began to reflect on the fact that he didn't even think that the trump he had so carefully hidden would become useless in an instant. But those statues that were approaching him didn't wait and began to attack him immediately. However, Jin Woo realized that the inventory he had could be used for his own purposes. He decided that he could handle it on his own. When one of the guards hit him with his large sword, Jin Woo blocked the blow and used his strength to shatter it. And he used the piece he had in his hands without hesitation and threw it back at that guard's head. The guard who was standing didn't realize what had hit his head. But Jin Woo didn't wait, and at this moment, he jumped up and used his foot to strike the piece of that stone sword that was stuck in the guard's head. By doing so, he knocked him to the ground. However, the other guard who was standing nearby also immediately attacked the hunter. But Jin Woo was very fast and blocked his strike using his Greeks. He cut his large weapon in half. He then jumped away from the first guard and started moving behind the back of the second guard. Using the blades he had in his hands, he began to attack and stuck them into the back of that huge guard's head. But that wasn't all. The next guards who were standing nearby began to use their stone bows and shoot towards the hunter, but all their arrows were in vain as Jin Woo repelled them. Jin Woo saw a huge arrow piece flying in the air.